I love interpersonal dynamics, man, as someone who also loves subtextual dynamics that can shape the framework of the series. I mostly always like the interpersonal dynamic which Sukuna and Yuji fortunately benefit from both. The Yuji-Sukuna dynamic is one for the history books, and as simple as different viewpoints on life. Put two individuals in the same body, but reverse their way of thinking, and you're brought with two of the greatest characters in Jujutsu Kaisen. They say opposites attract, and this statement couldn't be any more true, even if the meaning is slightly skewed in this context, because they're quite similar. They're bound to each other, meant to clash, and to come to the ultimate conclusion whose way of life is the correct way. The ultimate disregard for life, which is a product of your environment and stature of your abilities, Ryomen Sukuna. Protector of people, finding value in mundane actions with an unbreakable will to save all, Yuji Itadori. But how did these characters become who they were? Why do they hate each other so much? Today, let's explore the dynamic of Sukuna and Yuji, and why it's going to be one of the greater protagonist-antagonist dynamics the medium has ever seen, and how they share similarities within their characters. Human versus deity, simple right? That's the crux of the entire dynamic, from the framework of the story to how they're described by the narrative. A being that breaks every law and the optimization of a force of nature. In comparison, a shackled individual who bears humanity's wishes as the truest reflection of themselves, humanity's champion. But as previously stated, the dynamic is extremely subtextual and interpersonal, so let's break down into different sections to understand the purpose of this ideological clash. I'm going to move away very briefly to tackle the central themes surrounded by Jujutsu Kaisen. What is your view on humanity? The story has provided varied viewpoints that both have been embodied by respective champions within this context. The embodiment of a curse, and I don't mean literally cursed spirit, but those who devalue the merit of humanity and rather choose to see how they can be of benefit to themselves. To the opposite, those who see the beauty in small tasks, connections, and more importantly, everything that makes us human. The entire story has been working towards this central theme, and it can be explored in literally every arc in Jujutsu Kaisen. Fearsome Wound, focusing on morality specifically between Yuji and Megumi, with Sukuna's overarching presence in the arc. It's a very brief insight to what can occur for the latter stages between Megumi and Yuji, but I have a very exciting video to really deep dive into their potentially doomed friendship. I don't actually know the name of this arc, so I'm going to call it the Versus Mahito arc, which took a deeper introspection into the thematic setup of curses versus humans. Beyond that, the grey area that arises specifically shown through someone like a Junpei. However, the greater setup for roles was established perfectly through this arc, and the baby Sukuna being Mahito, and the perfect representation of Jujutsu sorcerer Nanami to then be inherited by both Sukuna and Yuji is a very nice touch. Goodwill, which is the arc that has the greatest focus onto humanity's struggles with each other, clashes such as Maki Mai, Mekamaru Panda, and more. It's an arc that is severely focused on the individual, so not too much to take from that aside from Yuji's perspective. Origins of Obedience, probably the most underrated arc in the series, which is perfectly set up for Yuji's internal conflict and for the Yuji we get in Shibuya. Morality of curse wounds and true reflection that curses being a broad term does not prevent them from sharing bonds or sharing human sentimentalities. Yuji killing his brother and Nobara affirming her resolve, and most importantly the removing of shackles from Megumi that conveniently is set up through Sukuna's words. There seems to be a major pathway that will be done for Sukuna and Megumi, but again subtextual their conflict is pivotal in this arc. Megumi letting go to disregard everything and establish power to defeat the finger bearer, whereas Yuji's intrinsic nature to rely on others to defeat their opponent. They're constantly clashing within the greater narrative, but let's continue in a very summarized version for the rest of the story. Hidden Inventory is one of my favorite examples of a role and how it can drive you insane in both aspects. Gojo with the role as the strongest and Geto's responsibility as a Jujutsu sorcerer. I don't need to recap the effects it had on both of their characters. But one aspect I love is how Geto was a symbol for the perfect ideal of a Jujutsu sorcerer, but ended up being burdened by said ideal. A nice little setup for our main character Yuji. Toji represents an outlier within the system, an example of freedom pertaining to breaking the predetermined fate of the user, or story, just like a certain antagonist this video is about. But primarily Shibuya handles all these examples the best until the Culling Games. Mahito and Yuji with a personal dynamic with the affirming of a role and what shackles both characters in their respective endless battle of humans versus curses. I think it's an even great touch in the most recent chapter. Yuji legit says let's end this cycle of curses. The introspection on character crisis and arc packed with so much thematic relevance, truly a goldmine. Sukuna being the one who embodied the ultimate natural disaster persona by being the reason it's called a Shibuya incident. But even this arc, Yuji and Sukuna conflict is very subtly built up through the lens of Mahito, but I'll come to this soon. Finally, Culling Games. The arc is an echo chamber for human desire spearheaded by Kenjaku and has the best characterization the series has brought. Yuji, Megumi, Maki, Yuta, I can keep going on, have all built up onto the thematic clash between Yuji and Sukuna, with most aligning themselves with Sukuna by becoming monsters. Even the original name for Culling Games being Annihilation Migration, players can represent as fishes, and them to become the dragon they must adapt to Sukuna's mindset in this criteria. However, the one who fights against and stays the same is this yin and yang being Yuji, fully building up on the arcs of symbolism between the two characters. It's even taken to a step further with the tiger analogy within Yuji's character, and Sukuna represented the dragon in this idea. However, as just mentioned, one person is consistent and constantly sticking to his humanity, Yuji Itadori, which sets up the backbone of the clash between Sukuna and Yuji, and this is beyond an interpersonal clash as it represents every stage of the story before what I predict the merger changes everything. But this is just the surface. What if we tackle the themes associated with their characters to further push the subtextual and interpersonal clashes of their dynamic? Love is the most twisted curse of them all. One of my favourite quotes said by Gojo, and both characters embody the love theme, however their means of expressing it couldn't be further from each other. Sukuna has an extremely bastardized sense of love, and in total thinks it's worthless. From the little pieces we can put together from his dialogue, he more likely than not has a somewhat tragic upbringing, but the importance is how he shows affection to others by slaughtering them. Kinda crazy, right? And in most cases the most brutal way possible. He burnt the volcano curse and spent the entire dreamscape scene praising him, rather offering advice to his lack of ambition. Cut Gojo in half and told him he cleared his skies, offering the highest of praise to any person we've ever seen. Cut Yurizu to acknowledge her technique, which in turn provided her with satisfaction. Split Kashimo into tiny pieces, which provided an answer to his question. His concept of love is directly correlated to specific trope and those who value the importance of strength. It's why Yuji cannot understand his way of life, when all the way back to Sukuna's quote on how he believes a hierarchy should work. He said it best to Kashimo, "We are loved because we are strong, and we simply respond to that love in kind." His concept of love is exclusive to only individuals that relate to the trope, but it also isn't. It's an extension of his overall worldview, where he separates the palette of humanity and why his reaction to different individuals is twisted. He is a deity who responds and provides relief to those, but his actions is depending on the user entirely. Higuruma showed him something of interest, so he cut him down, but Higuruma died with satisfaction of passing on to his role and finally saving an individual in the eyes of justice. The overall message is that his idea of love is purely for his self-satisfaction that relates nicely to the concept of hunger and greed, which is perfect. Sukuna has 4 arms, multiple mouths and eyes. He is a walking embodiment of self-love and greed, and is even rewarded within the narrative with the perfect optimization of Jujutsu sorcery that is personified by the King of Curses. The fact his true name doesn't exist, but rather an epithet of the pinnacle of Jujutsu sorcery, Ryomen Sukuna. It's even intertwined with his name Ryomen, translated to Two-Face, and Sukuna in Hindi translated to good deeds. If we use the Two-Face analogy, literally the two sides of good deeds is dependent on the user, is why the most part Sukuna brings satisfaction to those he kills, even in the most brutal way possible. I guess a weird dichotomy within that part of his character. The element of greed, which can be originated from his self-love, fits perfectly with the cannibalism tied to his character. From birth he denied his fate by eating his twin. To gain more power he eats his own fingers. There's the theory still how his curse technique originated from eating others. Granted not confirmed, is a consistent trait aligned with his character. But the idea of hunger, greed is tied to his character of self-preservation, simply put. The initial idea is twisted with his outlook of life, with the narrative and himself defining him beyond the morals of humanity. Sukuna separates him from the cursed spirits, sorcerers and humans, so he doesn't conform to the standards, and just like humans would eat animals for food, Sukuna will eat animals, humans or whatever because he's not binded by that human trait. This expands the idea of morality, because if anything Sukuna is treating everybody equally, but that's not only because he views himself beyond that, which is a product of his environment. He was born with the borderline of losing humanity simply from eating his twin. but instead of having bonds such as a Gojo, he rejected relationships and relishes in his isolation, which explains his ultra-hedonistic viewpoint on life. For his pleasure, he does what he wants, and is why he can disregard humans' life so easily and also enjoy the fleeting flavors of humanity, which makes up Yuji And Sukuna. It's fully boosted by the Hindu and Buddhism references with either Yama, Emma, Mara, or so forth, but continued the thematic usage is the idea of multiple bodily limbs. The theme of parasitism is embedded within his character, deeply as Sukuna is a parasite. The idea within Buddhism and Hinduism is to reference the different bodies these deities would have in one painting, but to extrapolate this to Sukuna is to show how inherently the idea of being a parasite is what makes him who he is. Hold on, let me explain this a little better. When you think of a parasite, you assume bacteria and something overly negative. But in this case, Sukuna, the constant stealing of others, vessels, and having multiple bodily functions is exactly what makes him have a strong sense of self and a lack of need for ideals. He's the most dominant one. Not like a Kenjaku who's a parasite that lacks a sense of self, he's wrapped by an insatiable idea of greed and agency, completely contrasted by Yuji's parasitic nature, but for the benefit of humanity, which I will touch on very soon. You could say both Yuji and Sukuna are redefining the viewpoint of parasites within this context, but the expression is what is important from the idea being brought. This relates to my final point of the series is battling ideas between Yuji and Sukuna, and primarily the theme of love is reflective of them, with the medium for this is the cursed energy itself, primarily a negative emotion that is used to dabble in sorcery, but Sukuna used it for his self-interest, self-guidance, of relishing the negative to provide a positive experience. His entire character is a paradox in itself because he's built so complex, yet his goal is so simple, further tying the two-faced analogy. But more importantly, he himself said we don't know the true nature of curses. So by setting up the stage of using a negative thing as a self-benefit, in comparison to his fall using it to extend compassion to others, we're met at a crossroads between two individuals who share the same body. But let's break down the love theme within Yuji Itadori. Just like with Sukuna, the origins that make up the character is how they express love within Jujutsu Kaisen. Yuji is a kind-hearted person who embodies the virtues of humanity boldly, but the humanity is constantly thrown in his face, and rather than embracing the negativity around him, he chooses to power through. Power system that is primarily negative in combination with a job description that is tailor-made to cut short the life of these who partake in it. He is the silver lining of hope, relief, redemption, compassion, and is perfectly aligned with the Buddhist inspirations within his character. Yuji's inspiration is a Buddha Vista who has vowed to not stop until he saved the suffering souls, and throughout the manga that is displayed constantly. The biggest change within Yuji's character is purely how his worldview has been slowly changing from being self-sacrificial compassion to a more positive approach and a greater emphasis on empathy. Jujutsu Kaisen chapter 266 is everything I love this series, and Yuji coming to terms with himself and how he extends compassion to others really builds on that dynamic with Sukuna. Just like Sukuna, he once stood in a peerless world, but that was just a regular world, a world without Jujutsu. Throughout the manga, he's been developing a level of empathy to view people as their own and not restrict their agency. However, the criteria of a person is very important. Let's look at the examples. His grandpa is the first showcase. His grandpa chose euthanasia to end his life to put to death without pain. This directly correlates his entire mindset throughout the early part of Jujutsu Kaisen and his concept of a natural death. He believed people needed to die without suffering, and is why when he tells Choso his brothers were crying, he feels resentful for the actions he made. However, unlike a Sukuna who would stay steadfast in their mindset, Yuji has understood that his own gifts, especially as superhuman, made him project some of his ideas onto others. A great example of this is Junpei. He told Junpei to come to Jujutsu High, become a better person, but did not actively provide him with agency to make his own decision. So this moment with Megumi is tremendous growth on his behalf. He reflected on his actions and did not tell Megumi he has to do anything because he's treating Megumi as a person, not some criteria of what he has to achieve or do, or more importantly, someone he has to save. I've said this before in multiple analysis, characters are guided by their own ethics, so forcing your ideals onto others is not fruitful. It's why Mahito taking away Yuji's agency to say he's just like him, shackled him to a self-sacrificial role as a cog. But Yuji is still a cog, but his outlook changed, which has made his role more positive, and those small minute details are impactful to his view on compassion. He treats people as humans and will do anything to save them. So perfectly with Megumi, we're simply telling him he'd feel lonely without him, not forcing him to make any decision. This concept of love is extending unyielding compassion to those, friends and foe alike. and is why he can show an ounce of pity to someone like Sukuna in a twisted way of compassion. But more importantly, how he's been presented in the manga as a vessel for humanity is one of my favourite aspects, which could correlate to the love theme. I said before that Yuji in himself is a parasite, but not necessarily robbing other people like a Sukuna, but gradually adding from his contemporaries. He inhabited Sukuna, and instead of Sukuna taking things from him, he rather receives his curse technique, which is an interesting way to spin things. But what I'm most interested in is analysing is how he used a common parasitic nature to literally inherit the wills of humanity. I'm not going to bore you with different ways parasites work, but a key trait is by consumption or temporarily being in their body. Yuji eats his curse wounds, receives a buff and has access to blood manipulation, fulfilling the consumption method. Yuji body swaps, learns ICT and simple domain, and then body swaps back, fulfilling the temporary hijacking of a body. All in all, the important lies on him literally and narratively taking on their powers and burdened to power through. The idea that he's a vessel for humanity by him taking in different aspects of humanity against the king of curses is thematically sound, and has the idea of two parasites clashing but originating from two different avenues. The strongest outside the framework of what he's familiar with, Jujutsu Yuji Itadori, and the pinnacle of Jujutsu Susui, Sukuna, just brings some interesting themes at play and the basis for why his hatred of their character is so deep. Most importantly, Yuji's viewpoint on compassion is directly influenced by him chasing ideal. However, it's also twisted to an extent. His idea of saving people is putting himself on a pedestal of being the righteous person, worthy of saving others. Let me explain this a little better. I said this before, an analysis when he kills the transfigured humans, he feels discontent because he views it plainly as killing humans. However, for the transfigured humans, especially those who cry out to die, he's providing them with a good death and freeing them from suffering. But to Yuji, that's just murder. So why is viewpoint already skewed? Well, Sukuna said it best in chapter 266. Feeling looked down upon aroused the feeling of negativity and is plainly due to what Yuji said. Yuji, if we take his words at face value, has become the hunter, and just like he did to Mahito, he's separating them as just a curse to be killed, or just a person to offer pity, because the roles have reversed that he's now strong enough to give that leeway. Compassion by Google definition is sympathetic pity and the concern of the suffering of others, which is exactly what he extends to Sukuna, pities him for his worldview, rather than coming to terms and accepting his way of life, which continues to elevate their hatred between each other. This perfectly connects to their personal dynamic and how their worldview has been shaped by their experiences and how they relate to each other. So why do Sukuna and Yuji hate each other so much? Well, it's quite simple. They both disregard the aspects of life they hold dear. Let's analyze this particular conversation they had when they went north to Yuji's hometown. I will stamp this arguably best chapter in the series' minimum top 3. Yuji is taking Sukuna on a trip to show him the value of humanity. The importance here is Sukuna isn't overly dismissive and actually indulges Yuji in his journey. Sukuna's comments are important here. Why he's dismissive to Yuji after some time, because he believes his lack of hatred has amounted to compassion for his foe. But why is that? Sukuna values ultimate strength. If his hatred amounted to not being motivated to kill his biggest opposition but redeem him, that is unsatisfactory and why he calls him weak. But the realization we get is quite the contrary. Yuji didn't meet with Sukuna with the intention of hearing his point of view because he declared he can't respect anyone who discards human life. He offers Sukuna one last chance at redemption, to switch sides, as an act of pity because in his point of view, he is now the hunter. Throughout the entire series, Sukuna has tormented Yuji, his way of life and everybody he cares about. He verbatim told him your future and everything is mine and has held true to that promise. However, Sukuna has been very static in his viewpoint. Yuji didn't expect Sukuna to change and even acknowledge he's not sure on the concept of right or wrong. But because he views himself as a savior, he's distinguished people in a similar manner as a Sukuna. I said earlier, Sukuna separates himself from humanity, but because of that his relationship is dependent on the user. But there's a simple line drawn between his relationship with humanity, really building up the deity persona. But as the title of the video says, Yuji and Sukuna are more alike than you think, and Yuji does the same but to a different extent. He separates the line between those he saves and himself. And this doesn't matter if you look at it at face value, but just like I talked about before with Junpei, with taking away his agency, this is an element of how his worldview clashes with his ideal. What is an ideal? It's something that exists only in the imagination, desirable or perfect, but unlikely to become reality. Sukuna said it best, Yuji has an unbreakable ideal, but it's only an ideal. He's chasing something unattainable, which is a consistent thing in Jujutsu Kaisen, but I won't elaborate too much. By Yuji separating himself from those he saves, he sent in an intentional bias of a power dynamic. He is the savior and you are the victim, and in that realm he doesn't leave them with much option. Look at the difference I noted in the Megumi situation in comparison to Sukuna or Junpei. Megumi, he didn't force him to be saved, but extended his own feeling of being lonely, which made him lock back in. He saw him as a friend, a human, not a victim he must save. Whereas Sukuna and Junpei, he fights them, showcases in a position of power, and with Junpei he tells him to come to Jujutsu High, not much option, when Junpei as he is very conflicted. He offers kindness and understanding, but the route out is one-dimensional. Please hear me out because I'll land my point. Yuji is the hero in his story, and by doing so he could not confirm to the evil person's perspective, which is why he pities Sukuna, not offering him understanding. It's consistent to how Yuji has been built throughout the entire series, and consistent with how an evil person is the one thing he can't tolerate. Sukuna also stubborn in his worldview, and regardless of someone's opinion will stick to it. There's two peas in the same pod, but the outlook is what differentiates the two. This is why Sukuna tweaks out. He understands the significant difference between his actions. And someone like Sukuna, who in terms will reject another way of life, he's now become the hunted. It's the Mahito quote, the reflection of humanity, but we've grown from I and you to the acknowledgement that they are the same. Whether it's in strength from two different outlooks of life, whether it's their viewpoint on humanity and how they relate to it. They are very similar, and this is why this video is titled Yuji and Sukuna are a lot more alike than you realize. Well, this wraps up the video, and I do appreciate you watching. With Jujutsu Kaisen ending soon, we will start doing some analysis, but we're slowly adding different series, so stay tuned for that. If you'd like to subscribe and drop a like, it's greatly appreciated. If you'd like to be a member, it'd be greatly appreciated. I do prioritize their videos earlier, so for my boy Calamity, now your Zenin video is on the works, but obviously, thank you guys for watching.